Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mad Mamluks podcast. My name is Sim. Along with me are my co-hosts, Sheikh Amir.
Assalamu alaikum.
And the host of Muzzy Buzz.
Assalamu alaikum.
One and only Mort. Welcome to the show, everyone. We are excited for a surprise episode. This podcast would not have been possible, first of all, by thanking Sheikh Hamza Makbul for allowing this show to happen because of this guest was invited by him and he gave him to us on loan. He is a late Ottoman history expert, a Muslim intellectual thought expert of the 19th and 20th centuries, Islamic constitutionalism and nation-state construction, ulema history of the late Ottoman state, identity and collective memory construction. Please welcome Dr. Yakoob Ahmed. Assalamu alaikum. All the way from Turkey.
That's right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for fitting us in your schedule.
No worries, anytime.
You had a very long day, lots of lecturing.
It's okay.
What brought you to Chicago?
Sheikh Hamza Makbul.
I know. Other than him, what are you talking about?
So I was doing Sheikh Hamza. So I was invited by a group of brothers, Wajahat and Omar Sheikh, to New Jersey to do a couple of talks. One of them was for Dr. Shahid al-Masri on Ottoman studies. So I was quite reluctant to come to the US. I said this to you before while we were getting here.
Is it the state of corruption in the United States, per se?
That's one of the reasons, yeah. But, I mean, you know, I left England and I went to the Muslim world and I wanted to invest in the Muslim world. I didn't feel the need to go to the West and sort of invest in that sort of, giving my agency in that sense. There are people here who can do that job. You have Ottoman studies departments, you have Ottoman historians, you didn't really need me. But I was teaching a class in Turkey with Sheikh Hamza, and he used to teach Aqidah and I would teach history after him, and he would sit in on my classes, right? So then he was convincing me, look, we need to do something for you coming to the US and so forth. Wasn't too convinced in that sense at that time. I still thought I'm content in Turkey. And then these two students who invited me over, I was teaching a course online. They took that course. They've been asking me for 2 years. Finally, they said, look, can you come over to the US? And I had a student with me who I was talking to off the cuff. And he says, oh, what are you going to say to Allah? So I looked at him and said,
I love those kind of guys.
You know, and I just looked at him and said, what do you mean? Like, dude, they don't need me out there. And he goes, are you sure? You keep going to the UK, but maybe Muslims want to hear what you have to say. I mean, yes, there are Ottoman historians out there, but maybe you might do something different. Your opinion matters, right? And I have, in the sense of my own opinion, I don't feel the need that I have anything different to say than anyone else, but they felt differently. So these guys, anyway, to cut a long story short, they invited me to Jersey City. Hamza Makbul, Sheikh Hamza Makbul knew that I was there, booked my flight to Chicago, then got me to do a two-day weekend course for the MSA at Chicago University for a Muslim audience as a way of teaching them Ottoman history as Islamic history from a Muslim perspective, right? Which is what's missing in Western academia in that sense. Like,
Yes, it is.
And I sort of make the argument that I had a host of challenges in Western academia. And so, like, both in terms of identity as a way of being born in Britain, but also when I was studying Islamic history, that I felt a sense of dislocation. Dislocation in the sense of identity in terms of being British Muslim, but a dislocation in terms of Islamic history as well, as a history that resonates with me. And I still have that challenge in Western academia in that sense. So I personally don't care what Western academics think of me in that sense. I've now invested my time of trying to teach my students over a prolonged period of time that this history is theirs and it matters to them and they should internalize it. And so I have this joke, which is I'm not an academic, I just do academia. You know what I mean? As a way of just navigating the space. But for me, it's just, we're Muslim, we have a different sort of like purview, so I'm trying to please Allah. I invest in my students wholeheartedly. I get paid to do dawah. That's my job. It's great.
Alhamdulillah. So how did you, did you always want to be involved with history growing up, or how did this come all about?
No, I failed everything as a kid. So I was a terrible.
So you were like me.
I don't know. But I was a terrible student.
You made it out.
I was a terrible student. You know, and there was a sense of disappointment. I did my undergrads. I scraped through my undergrads where I passed that with good grades, alhamdulillah. But in business computing, And that was the sector I was in, but I wasn't satisfied. So if you'd asked me at the age of 25, 26, you're going to be an Ottoman historian, I'd have laughed in your face. That was not even in the imagination. But it's when I moved to Syria, I was studying Arabic there. And a friend of mine, Abdul Rahman, he used to bring these books over. He's a convert to Islam. His name's Steve Ide. He used to study in Turkey but live in Syria, and he used to go backwards and forwards. His wife was from Syria at the time, and he had kids, and he was working backwards. He would bring these books, and I would just read them. And I found it interesting because in Damascus you would see the Ottoman part. So like the Hijaz railway station, that was a coffee shop, right? The market, Suq al-Hamidiyya, so the market of Abdul Hamid, they had food which was called Midhat Pasha. So you would see that, you were aware of that, but once again, none of it made sense to everyone. People were just walking past these buildings every day. For me, like, I was intrigued. And then my mum got sick, so I came back to England, did a master's, and that was the game changer for me. That when I did that master's, in the beginning, I didn't feel like I deserved to be there, because I'm a working class kid from a working class background. But then I made myself comfortable at the fact that I do deserve to be here. Then went to Turkey. Well, first went back to Syria, and then the war happened, and went to Turkey, and then I did my PhD in London, and as I say, the rest is history.
The rest is history.
So you went to SOAS, these studies of Oriental and African Studies?
That's
is it?
right.
Yeah. That's a premier university in UK. Many people don't know about it, but it's a very difficult school to get into.
Yeah, that's right.
Being a poor student, how did you get in there?
I paid for it.
Oh, I didn't know that's easy.
I worked full time,
Yeah.
and when I did the application forms, I got my head in the books, and I mean, when I got accepted, they said that this is a bit rusty, we're not too sure, and I actually tried to convince them. I said, look, I know what I'm doing, give me a break. And they gave me that break, at the master's level. At the PhD level, by then, I had started to understand how the mechanism works. By now, I started to figure out what academia is about. I mean, I lacked that training. And that training you usually get from privileged backgrounds, you know. I didn't have a great schooling in that sense. So in my master's, when I did my first essay, I failed it. And I remember there was a girl she was a white girl, and I said, can I have a look at your essay? And she got an A, and I didn't, and I just compared them. I took them home, and I just kept looking at them and said, okay, is this what I need to do in terms of writing? And I was self-teaching myself, in that sense, working full-time teaching English to try to get by. But my teacher at the time, Ben Faulkner, who's at Arizona University right now, he used to be at SOAS, he was great. Mashallah, he was really helpful. So he said to me, I remember once saying, I don't care if you write in hip-hop, so long as I understand it. Because I was very street. So even in the way I speak right now, this is a form of code switching. Because when I speak street, nobody really understands.
Oh, wow. I would never have taken you for that.
Yeah. So this form of code switching happens because when you go into academia, there's a particular perception people have of you in the way that you speak from the street.
Yes.
So they try to marginalize you straight away. The second thing is when you're living in Turkey, nobody understands street language anyway, in that sense. But when I'm at home, you go back into what we call roadman language.
Yeah.
And you use that. And that's intriguing in of itself, that to some degree, as a way of going up, once again, when we talk about dislocation, right, you have to dislocate yourself from a particular environment that you've come from. And that's been tough.
It's almost like whitewashing.
To some degree, yeah.
Because like you got to speak, for example, even the job, right? Like I can't go out and speak to you how I speak to you. I have to, hey, how you doing? My name's Murtaza. Nice to meet you.
Right. So when you're on the phone, for example, you're talking to the government or taxis. I used to do this for my mother. You'd have to put on this accent so you can get by.
Yeah.
And so this is what happened. And then you just get better at the switching of the codes in and out, in and out. And then, alhamdulillah, the advantage I got from that was I found a way of speaking street speak when I'm teaching Ottoman studies, right? So you'd use examples that they understood. So I started doing some of the masjid circuits in London as a way of trying to teach Ottoman history to people there, and you can make the switch. So you're actually dealing with two different spaces. The difficulty is, I guess, is that there's a part of me, and this is a very English thing, where when you're working class, some people want to climb out the working class environment, but many of us feel attached to the working class environment because of a sense of authenticity. And when you feel like you're leaving that, you feel like, you're abandoning something that you feel authentically attached to. And you can feel a sense of betrayal in that sense, that look, I'm leaving my people behind. But people are fascinated because they were celebrating the success that one from the community actually succeeded. Not only that, one from the community left the country, which that type of migration was unheard of.
Yeah. So when you say community, where are you from? Manchester, Birmingham? Where are you
South
from?
London.
So what does that mean?
South. So
Like Brixton.
close to Brixton.
Close to
Yeah,
Brixton.
very close to Brixton. I was a 20-minute walk away from Brixton in Clapham. After I left, my mum went to Tooting, or Tooting as they say, and it's a predominantly Pakistani area, and she's happy, content living there. And so that was the environment I was raised in.
So what team do you support?
Liverpool.
Liverpool.
And people always ask this question, why Liverpool? And I say, well, I'll tell you why. Growing up, there was a black player by the name of John Barnes. We didn't have any ethnic minorities or Muslims that we could subscribe to, that resonated with us. But John Barnes was that one player who every ethnic minority turned to, right? Left-footed footballer, was black, played for Liverpool. Liverpool were also successful. They were winning everything. As a child, that's what you support. But that stuck with us.
Nice.
Yeah.
You're a boxing fan?
Yeah, I watch boxing.
Tommy Fury won. You happy about that?
I think he was going to win anyway.
I didn't watch the
It was
fight.
tough for him though.
Was it?
Yeah. I mean, I saw the fight, but
Was it?
yeah, I mean,
Was it
but
tough, or did they deliberately make it tough so that you can have a second round?
I don't know. We'll see
Yeah,
what happens. But
yeah.
yeah, so it's good. Every single person I meet from the UK is going to be football or soccer. Who
Yeah.
say it?
Footy, as they call
Footy.
it.
Footy.
Footy. Yeah, it's going to be boxing.
Yeah.
Right. So that's pretty cool. Yeah.
So,
Awesome.
so why Ottoman history out of everything you could have chosen? Why? That's something that I've really been curious about.
So once again, like I said, when I was living in Syria, the Ottoman past was visible. I was surprised that the people in Syria, in the establishment, were anti-Ottoman. I actually didn't know what the Ottomans were. Then I went on a holiday to Istanbul, and then you just look and say, what is this? And then the books that my friend Abdul Rahman gave me, one of the questions that kept asking me is, where did it collapse? How did it happen, right? So I wanted to know that you're learning about this great Islamic empire. Well, certain Muslims are not seeing them as great anymore. That was an issue. Like, why is that taking place? What did they do so wrong? Because when you're reading the works, you don't actually see that they were problematic, but when you're living in those countries, there's a particular agitation towards that. That was one. And the second thing is, if they're a great empire, how did it collapse? And, in that sense. And so that became the driving force. And I actually took a module in Ottoman studies just to see if I was interested or not. And then I became interested. And I was the only Muslim, sorry to interrupt you, in that classroom, right? So there was a Turkish sister with me, she was there. But Turks take that as bread and butter. Everyone else was non-Muslim, and I was the only Muslim. And I used to speak to other Muslims, and they had no interest, and I couldn't understand why. So then that just piqued my interest more. I said, I'm going to keep going.
People say empire, they have an issue, just semantically, when they relate the Ottomans to an empire.
So I think that's a problem of language, actually. I think the English language as a medium doesn't have an alternative term that we can use that can aptly explain this phenomena of having a dynasty that's ruling over this landmass, right?
Got it.
The word empire is loaded, especially in regards to the 19th century. And when you look at the European empires, the word empire is loaded when we talk about the United States of America in that context. But when we're looking at the Ottomans in particular, I mean, in our language, in Arabic, is Dawla Uthmaniyya.
Yeah.
Right? Or so in that sense, it's the Ottoman Dawla. Or state, right?
State,
in that sense. But even here, that state and today's state are two different meanings still. So this is why
I see.
So when people say like the Islamic State, that's not a helpful translation of what that was, because it's a khilafah, which is different from an Islamic state. An Islamic state is a state which is Islamic. And how do you make sense of that? And the Ottomans were not always a khilafah as well. So Fatih's reign is not a khilafah in that sense. You know what I mean? So then you have to try to qualify what this is. Now, the English medium, once again, doesn't have this. When you're doing it in Turkish, they have various words to describe this. So they have words like beylik, and like in our tradition, we have words like wizara, sultanate, emara, khilafa, various types of words.
Wilaya.
Exactly, as a way of explaining the different formulations we have of governance. But English is very limited in that sense in terms of what it can give in terms of explanation. And I make this argument that English as a language is not helpful in understanding Islamic history.
So it's like an oversimplification because of the fact that it's almost like an incorrect translation of what it means. It carries a certain connotation, and then so people apply those meanings of modern definitions to. But so you mentioned something which is I think we want to touch on a little bit. There's always the discussion about was the Ottoman quote unquote empire truly a khilafah or not?
Yeah.
And I think people make those arguments for various different reasons, right? Some are politically motivated, some are religiously motivated.
Yeah.
But you did just mention that at certain times of period it was, and certain times it wasn't. So since we're kind of focusing on the end period, like the latter period of the Ottoman Empire, in your opinion, would you still consider it to be a khilafah at that later point?
Yeah, of course. It fits the
And to
condition.
those that say that it was more of a sultanate or more of a just not
Monarchy.
necessarily monarchy or based on nepotism, what would you argue in that case?
I wouldn't say. I mean, okay, look, those are very simplistic arguments that people put forward, and one of the problems we have is that today Muslims enjoy talking about the Islamic past like people do in a pub talking about a football game. Right, we're just going to talk about this and this, that, yeah, this is not this is not that. And you say, wait, okay, technically explain to me, how does this not fit the model? And they can't technically explain it because they haven't gone through the technical arguments in actuality. So in that sense, when you look at the Ottoman Empire, okay, let's look at the Ottoman Empire as a khilafah at the time of the 19th century. Very few people disputed that it was a khilafah at that moment in time. Apart from maybe the Wahhabis who just rejected the Ottomans thinking they're doing shirk on everything, right? But even the emergence of the Salafi movement, when we're talking about the modern Salafi movement or the reformist one, not the one of today. So Sheikh Rashid Rida, Muhammad Abdu and these sort of people. Sheikh Rashid Rida was critical of the Ottomans by saying the methodology they used to get to the Khilafah was probably not apt. In his opinion, his scholastic opinion, it should belong to somebody who's Qurayshite. But still accepted it was a Khilafah by default. So in that sense, when you look at the scholarship at the time, we don't see this type of argument that we are now drawing on right now. And it's because, I was teaching this today, we have an imagination of a historical khilafah, what it ought to be, right? And this is then you see there's a problem of history in the way that we imagine it, in that sense. And the go-to comparison is the Khulafa Rashidun, in that sense. But that's a very different model of a very specific moment in Islamic history. So when we look at, let's just say, the case of Muawiyah, for example, and why this sort of like dynastic sort of possibility happened in the time of Muawiyah. It actually happens on the time of Marwan II, because Muawiyah, he dies, his son Yazid dies like a year later, and then Marwan II dies 6 months later. Bang, bang, bang. So they're thinking, right, if we want to maintain the continuity of this thing, where we don't have the capacity to do elections, it's a large landmass now, different types of people in Iraq, in Khorasan, in Egypt, and so forth. We're maintaining the authority in Damascus. So when Marwan comes, he goes, I will be the Khalifa, but after me is my son and then the next one. He puts this stipulation as a way of safeguarding a particular continuity, and then that becomes a particular sort of like practice, right? In the Ottoman case, it's a little bit different. The House of Osman makes the argument as a level of continuity in the sense that we do politics, and it makes an agreement with the Janissaries, the other militaries, the ulema and so forth, that this is the way we're going to do practice. People accepted that at the time because that was the norm. There was no presidential system in those days.
So these were concessions that were made between different parties for the sake of having a state that had organization.
That's right. And
okay. So
you see a corpus of work. So when Selim conquers the Arab provinces, for example, right? Like the level of dissent you would expect as a way of rejecting Selim's conquest of the Arab provinces should be exceptionally high. Now people make the argument, for example, that the Mughals were not happy about it. Well, firstly, who cares what the Mughals think? In the sense that the Ottomans are interested locally in terms of where the legitimacy comes from. For them, legitimacy is the Balkans, Anatolia, the Arab provinces. They can't control everybody. It's natural that the Mughals are going to contest the Ottomans at this moment, because they've seen a shift from a nominal Abbasid Caliphate to the Ottoman state. And they say, what's going on here? Like, how is this possible? We reject this, because they see it as an imposition, which is unacceptable. But within 100 years, across the board, everyone's just confined. We accept it.
Yeah, so I kind of want to talk about that too for a minute, because it seems to me that to the later period of the Ottoman Empire, it seems that there was a symbolic Khalif. At least it appears to be that way. And for the most part, most other of the Umarat were kind of autonomous in a way that it was like, okay, we have our own rules, our own systems. Even the way of handing over power was different from place to place. But it was more of a symbolic recognition that there is a central government over the entire Muslim place. Now, The reason why I mention this is because obviously this is a hot topic now because people, especially in the Arab world now, this notion of trying to downplay the Ottoman influence, right? Because obviously there's some political leanings there. However, I want to explore that for a moment because I do think that there is something worthy talking about there, and I could be wrong about this, but weren't there concerns as the Ottoman period began to wind down that the Ottoman Empire was forced as itself as an empire to make concessions to other colonial powers? Like, for example, in the case of Lebanon with France, and the notion that, you know, okay, the Arab world was kind of shaken that, hey, if they're going to piece out land, then what's the legitimacy now?
The legitimacy by this moment is not based on the fact of how strong you are. Your legitimacy is based on the fact of you are a khilafah. Now, if you're losing entities and so forth, that's showing that this khilafah is having problems and things like that. So that's a different type of question in that sense. Legitimacy is not based on that. In that sense, do you understand?
Right? No, understood. Right? I guess I mean, in their minds, they're probably thinking like, what? I guess what I'm arguing for is that in their mind, I could see why they would say, well, we don't really want to be loyal to them anymore because we don't know if that loyalty to us is there, right? If they're going to be able, if they're making concessions.
But throughout Islamic history, and especially Ottoman history, people are continuously negotiating with the Ottoman center. These negotiations are never static. These negotiations are always evolving over time. And continuously there's the center and the other provinces acceptance and not. So Yemen, for example, Yemen becomes part of the Ottoman Empire twice. It becomes part of the Ottoman Empire again under Sultan Abdulhamid II.
Yeah.
Sudan becomes part of the Ottoman Empire, or nominally under Mehmed Ali Pasha of Egypt. So you're losing areas and gaining areas. And what you see in the latter period of the Ottoman Empire, especially the late period, is something interesting in the way that the United States of America operates as. But you've got your provinces, and then you have your sphere of influence. So we look at America today, it doesn't rule over Europe, it doesn't rule over Australia, but it's the head of the Western world, right? So it rules over the United States, but it has a particular hegemonic function in the way that it influences Europe and Australia.
So in the form of the UN, everyone knows that that's the seat of the US in Europe.
That's right.
Okay, so now coming back a little bit, just rewinding, that was just in my head, but let's kind of rewind just for the audience. So we were talking about like the late Ottoman period, right? What would you define, what time period begins like the latter part of the Ottoman Empire, historically speaking?
I mean, the problem is that in the field of Ottoman studies, they have what they call periodization, which is a little bit problematic because we don't live in a life of periodization, right? But you say 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and so forth. In the field of Ottoman studies, the 19th century, so the late 18th, 19th century is seen as late Ottoman history. But actually, it's called that based on the idea of modernity. When modernity comes into play regarding Europe and then the Ottomans, that's perceived as a latter period. So there's a transition between a pre-modern state and a modern state.
Can you break that down? Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you: is modernity defined by like social progress? Is it because I mean that term is loaded, right? Like, does that just mean having trains, or does that mean like I don't know, allowing women to vote? Like, I mean, that's a very different.
So it's the period of modernity is loaded in the sense that firstly, I make the argument that modernity is a narrative, right? In that sense, and it's a Western European narrative, and the Europeans like. They create a particular standard of what it means to be modern, and that still exists today. So like, if you're going to be modern, the Muslim has to stand up to a standard of what the West considers as being modern, right? So in that sense, the problem with the word modernity is it's very fluid, it keeps changing over time, and it's continuously used as a stick as a way of differentiating between peoples, West and non-West.
And that was the reason why I was getting there, because I'm like, it seems like a very loaded term, because one could argue that as much as Saudi Arabia has progress, they could say, oh, it's not modern yet.
Yeah, exactly. So in that sense, you start to make the argument of who decides who's modern and not.
And that's what I was trying to get at. Like, it seems like a very biased view. It seems like almost a term used to kind of say that, hey, you're not up to our standard yet.
Right. So in the 19th century, when we're talking about, they have this idea called alternative modernities and multiple modernities. The idea that Europe is not the only standard in which we talk about modernity. The other nations had ways of closing the gap as the world is becoming globalized, right? But the main marker is technological advancements, changes in military practices, changes in political practices and the way that states became bureaucratic, international law, moving away from the colonial practice and so on. And these are all manifestations of modernity in that sense. So prior to that, we didn't have these centralized homogeneous states. And in the period of modernity, we start to see the emergence of nationalism, the nation state, the construction of the nation state, and so forth. Now, the West generally presents modernity as something positive, but there is a caustic side to modernity, the violence, the colonialism, and so on, right? But fundamentally, it's also the introduction of capitalism, right? The emergence of a particular form of capitalism, which is changing the world.
So that's really interesting because a lot of times the limited history books that I've read, I know they mention kind of like you said, there's a difference of opinion about what modern or late period Ottoman. Some will say post-Tanzimat reforms, and some will say, well, at the time, like I believe there was a moment where the Ottoman Bank kind of made concessions to the British Empire, right? And they say, well, that kind of marks, because now the Brits were controlling the economy.
I think in the sense of historians, we make the argument that having this starting moment is problematic. In that sense, but we have a general phase or period, but actually having this is the moment where the match was lit is a little bit problematic. Now, nation states do that. Nation states have this idea that we have an independent state. We have a day where we were formed. That's the beginning. And so then we've internalized this idea that there's a beginning moment and so on. But if you look at Islamic history, we don't actually look at things like that. So we don't have that idea of a beginning moment. So when we're doing Islamic history, we don't see it like that. And so in the case of modernity, there's never a moment where people say today is modernity.
Right.
It's now historians, and this is why history is ideological, going back in time and constructing the narrative of modernity in their image, and then saying this is a starting point, and then they compare the rest of the world in comparison to, which is Western Europe and the United States.
So it's purely based on analysis and hindsight.
Sure.
I mean, you could never know that while you're actually living it.
So we're living this right now. What are we calling this that we're living? We don't have a name for it. We just live, right?
Yeah.
And people, when they talk to me about this question about Ottoman decline and so forth, which is also problematic in Ottoman studies, if I ask you right now, is America declining? People can't answer that question to me.
Well, some would argue, yeah.
Yeah, some would argue, yeah, right? And some would argue, well, it's a bit more complicated, not so much.
Yeah.
And people on the outside, so actually it's still a superpower. It's still hanging on. So
on what
perception.
Level too, On what level is there some type of weakness? But just one quick thing. You talked about periodization or over-periodization. What would be the optimal way to classify history then, rather than periodization? Or did I misunderstand that?
No, I mean, to some degree, we need some sort of markers of dates to know where transitional points are and milestones and so on. But the idea would be, when you go 16, 17, 18, 19th century, life just doesn't work like that. It's just one big blur.
Major events.
Yeah, but we were looking at like these discursive transitions that are taking place. And then how do you make sense of an empire so large that's continuously evolving and moving, shifting and so forth, right? So maybe we need to approach it differently.
Yeah, it's not as simple as we thought it was.
Did you ask ChatGPT about what caused the decline of the Ottoman Empire?
I haven't tried that app.
Well,
whatsoever.
I have.
What did it say?
For you.
What did it say?
This is where the mad part comes in, Mad Mamluks.
Okay. See, I'm an Ottoman historian, and the Ottomans did destroy the Mamluks. So it's kind of intriguing being here today.
Hey, guys, maybe it's time to get revenge.
All right. So here we go. I asked him before the show. I thought there would be some good talking points here.
MashaAllah, look at that handsome fellow there.
And that was quite soon. Yeah.
By the way, I wasn't expecting you to look like kind of more down to earth because I thought you were like a professor there.
I like the garb though.
Thank you.
Because I always wear a fitted, but I'm like, you know what? Today I'm going to look like more professional for you.
Thank you very
so
much.
I put on a kufi.
That's so good, bro. No, so that was for a conference, that picture.
Hang on one second. This thing popped out. Okay. So I'm trying to put this here. Let's see. Are you guys still seeing this?
Should I read that for you? You got it?
I just want to make sure that the listeners can see it.
I think they can. I can see it.
Can they see it?
Well, why don't you?
Oh, yeah, they can't see it. Okay, there we go. All right. Go ahead, Mort.
The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a complex process that took place over several decades and was caused by a combination of internal and external factors. Here are some of the key reasons. Number one, internal weakness. The Ottoman Empire was plagued by internal weakness, including political corruption, economic stagnation, and social unrest. The central government was often unable to effectively control its vast territory and was weakened by factionalism and infighting.
Okay, so do you agree with that? Point one.
So in relation to the question, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, these points actually make sense. If you said the decline of the Ottoman Empire, then they wouldn't.
Oh,
I
okay.
see.
Okay.
So we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about the
Yeah.
difference between those
So
two.
number 2, military weakness. The Ottoman Empire's military was also weakened by years of conflict, including World War I, which severely depleted its resources and manpower. The military also suffered from outdated tactics and equipment, making it vulnerable to modern armies.
Now, that's not necessarily true. I mean, there's parts of it that is true in terms of manpower, which is that people forget that the Ottomans did not have an infinite amount of manpower, so they couldn't compete with the colonial powers, who had a larger tap where they could draw from India.
That pretty
so
much modern enslaved people and
That's
forced
right.
them to fight.
That's right. But
Yeah.
it wasn't a weakness in that sense, or depleted manpower for a long period of time. It's just it didn't have population growth.
So I think in that regard, and plus because I think it's interesting to note here too that the way the Ottomans view subjects versus how the other colonial empires view subjects was very different.
That's right.
Like they felt more of an amana,
Yeah.
where the British
Right.
and other empires
Yeah.
and Russian probably felt like
Human shields.
they have to fight for
Yes,
us.
that's right. And Muslims were being shot and executed for not fighting for the British government. That was clear. So what you see here is, imagine the British have India, Australia, and all the other colonies. And what you see with the Allied forces is they had allies that they could work with. The Ottomans have zero Muslim allies. They're all
So
colonized.
I want to come back to the India part
Yeah.
because I think it's super, to me, it's fascinating
Yeah.
in regards to Ottoman history.
Yeah.
But I think that plays a huge part in some of the issues as to how the British Army got its strength and how it relates to the Ottoman Empire.
India was a cash cow, you know what I mean? In that sense.
I mean,
like-
just so we're already here right now, can you imagine this? In the 1700s, when the Mughal Empire was in India and the British Empire first got its ground in India, India represented about 24% of the world's entire GDP.
Yeah.
By the time in 1947, when the British Empire pulled out, India represented less than a percent. They went from a nation that used to export textiles and goods to a nation that imported this stuff.
Yeah.
Imagine that for a moment. They used to make stuff that they're now buying. They have to import.
And the amazing thing about India at the time was that it was larger than Europe and was making more money than Europe combined. So imagine the tap that the British had caught on to in that context, right?
Yeah.
So the Ottomans couldn't compete with something like that.
But so since we're here, I'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that since we're talking about late Ottoman period, there was the All Indian Muslim League had this idea to revive, in some ways, the Ottoman Caliphate
Yeah, the Caliphate Committee.
in India.
Is that what they call it, the Caliphate
I mean,
Committee?
so
Oh.
let me
Is that
try
what they
to.
refer to it as, the Caliphate Committee?
So there was a Caliphate Committee that was trying to save the Ottoman Empire.
So let me
India.
let me
Yeah.
just kind of say what I know, and you can
Okay.
tell me if I'm wrong here.
Right.
So apparently, this is toward the end after they had been deposed of, right? I think it was Sultan Abdul Majid, right? So apparently, the All Indian Muslim League, and at that time, the Nizam of Hyderabad was very wealthy. So the idea was that he actually had his son marry one of the Ottoman princesses,
Yeah.
with the hope that their heir would be the heir apparent for the Ottoman Khilafah, given that the Indians had the wealth, the money, and they had the respect. Like
Yeah.
people recognized them as people, because I think at that time he was living in Syria, or no, maybe somewhere in Europe. I think
He went to Switzerland.
Switzerland, right? Correct. And so what ends up happening is that the All Indian Muslim League jumps on board, and they apparently try to pacify the Arab states at that time. They went to Jerusalem, they went to the Muslim conference, and the Arabs just said, no, we don't want nothing to do with it. And so they were kind of forced to be like, okay, well, what happened then? By that time, India decided to not accept the Indian state of Hyderabad, and they wanted to come down on it and abolish it and exit completely. And then that kind of leaves them at a place where.
Yeah, so that is an interesting thing that you say. So before that, in World War One, when 1918 the Arab provinces are lost, then in India you see the emergence of the Caliphate Committee. So Maulana Kalam Azad, the Ali Johar, and so forth, and Abdul Bari, and these sort of people, who are in prison, by the way, during World War One. The British tried to stop them from having any influence, but they managed to create a particular momentum of moving towards supporting the cause in the Ottoman Empire. And this is people in India, including women, are selling their gold, sending it to Turkey or the Ottoman Empire at that time in the War of Independence to try to save this empire in that sense, right? It fails. As it fails, the British have killed two birds with one stone. The collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate that becomes the Turkish Republic also kills the Caliphate Committee. Okay, so both of them are out. then in terms of that, what happens is when they both get out, what happens is that you have the emergence of the Muslim League in India as a response to that. They are still now thinking about identity and whatnot. And the state of Hyderabad in particular, or the Hyderabadis, right, in World War One, held a neutral position. They didn't want to upset the British.
Right.
But at the same time, they didn't. So they sort of like stayed out.
Because they were getting paid.
That's right. Now, when the state collapsed, the idea is I'll marry my son off to the daughter of the Khalifa.
Wow.
Richest Muslim in the world, with the symbol of the Muslims of the world, having this unity in the hope that they will revive. Then they had conferences in both Egypt and Quds, and then they realized this is not going to work out.
So that was the last strand of hope.
That was the last strand of hope. In their imagination, yeah, that's right.
But the problem is that, to be fair, it just happened too late, and
Yeah.
it was only when the Indian Nizam realized that Brits no longer supporting him.
Yeah.
They had the idea to pull out of India.
Yeah.
So he panicked and was like, okay, well, we can do it this way.
Yeah, and all these imaginations are interesting. Why? Because so the marriage doesn't work out, and then she moves to England, refuses to go back to Turkey. She says, I'm done. And she dies in England. What's intriguing as
You're talking about Nilofer?
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Wow.
And then, but there's another one that was married to the niece of the Majid was married to the guy who just recently passed, Mukarram Jah.
Yeah.
So he was actually the heir apparent, and his son that's now there is technically the heir apparent.
Yeah,
to
but that's
the
never going to happen. But
Yeah.
what's intriguing is then that's how you get the emergence of the idea of the state of Pakistan,
Yeah.
right? So the idea of Pakistan, which is having a millah for Muslims, happens because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, unable to revive the Ottoman Empire, putting all your eggs in one basket in the hope that the Ottoman Empire would win World War One. Then Muslims getting jarred and saying, okay, what do we do now? And this is interesting as well, because if the British were at their height at the end of World War One, within 20 years they lose India, which is World War Two.
Subhanallah.
Right? So you see that how it flips. And then you have the idea of what do we do, and then the idea that some people have the idea that we keep this unified India, we're against the idea of creating the state of Pakistan, and other Muslims moving towards the idea of the state of Pakistan, creating a state for Muslims. And then the ulema create a constitution that 5-6 years later, and a lot of Ottoman symbolism exists in that sense. I was explaining to some brothers recently, if you see the flag of the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, and then you compare it to the flag of the Nation of Islam, it's virtually the same.
Yeah.
Right? And so what you see at that moment in Islamic history, so the Young Turk Revolution flag has a flag which is the Turkish flag, right? Freedom, liberty, justice, blah, blah, blah. But it's written in Ottoman Turkish. Translate those words to English. They start to look like the flag of the Nation of Islam. So here, that moment in history is really intriguing, where different people and different types of people who subscribe to being Muslim or whatnot are pulling from the Ottomans still as a repository, as a way of creating the imagination of their identity, because prior to that, nobody had another imagination apart from the Ottoman Empire.
And they couldn't fathom it.
No.
I mean, it's kind of like the
the flag
idea.
we're talking about?
Yeah, so if you see it says Hurriya, which means freedom, Adalat, which means justice, Uhuwa, which means, and
The
Musawat, and Ittihad
okay.
in the center, right?
The airlines.
So
Unity.
Ittihad means unity,
yeah, sorry.
right?
Yeah.
So we have fraternity, liberty, freedom,
Brotherhood,
justice,
yeah,
and
yeah.
and now if you put up the flag of the nation, you see it's very similar.
When you said Ittihad, he's like the airlines.
Yeah. But no, I mean, this is like so could one before we go back to ChatGPT, could one make the argument as a historian that possibly the outcome of the Ottoman state would have been very different had the Indian Muslim kingdoms took a more proactive role in supporting them?
It's a difficult question to answer, but I think that if Muslim states were able to support the Ottoman Empire, then we would have had a different world right now. In that sense, that the Ottomans just had no one to have coalitions with.
It's amazing,
right?
I mean, it's sad but amazing at the same time.
I mean, you mentioned that, but I actually asked to ChatGPT as well. So it says here that the reform. Hang on one second. Let me.
You can just read off of it. It's fine.
Yeah. So there's 5 points it lays out as what could have been done differently to prevent the Ottoman Empire's collapse. So real quickly, without adding all the other explanations that it's saying, point 1, it's saying reform the government. Point 2, modernize the military. Point 3, address economic problems. Point 4, grant more autonomy to all the regions and ethnic groups that it was ruling over. And point 5, avoid alliances with Germany and Austria-Hungary.
Right. So all these points, to some degree, the Ottomans did that, right? They modernized their military. When you see in World War I, they actually closed the gap phenomenally well. The problem they have in World War I is they're fighting the Russians, the British, and the French.
The gap they closed with the Air Force?
Not only the Air Force, but the ground troops. So if you read some of the works of the Germans who are on the ground writing their diaries and biographies, they were just absolutely shocked at how the Ottomans were surviving this war effort in that sense. So fundamentally, that wasn't the main issue. I mean, it's a different type of war.
But there was a gap, though, right? Like in terms of
there was
a technological gap earlier, and then they closed it because I remember reading about the ammunition that the Ottomans had, that it wasn't matching the guns that they were making or they were purchasing. So they had some problems, but you're saying that they closed that gap quickly and they were ready to fight in World War I pretty well.
So I'll give you an example which might be unpopular in this country, but the Taliban sort of, survived it out with AK-47s.
Yeah, right.
So what I'm saying to you is it's a simplistic argument to make the assumption that they didn't have the same weapons or they didn't have weapons that were just as good, and that's the reason why they lost. One of the questions we put forward in that sense is they still also didn't have manpower. They didn't have the population. You got to understand, this is an empire that has a particular population of which how much of that population is adult male that's able to fight.
Right.
Yeah. Forget the women, children, and so forth.
Able and willing.
Right. And so in that sense, the numbers that were available to them as a way of having this type of war effort was not the same in comparison to the Russian Empire, the British, and the French.
So you said this, sorry to cut you off, but one thing, and pardon my ignorance, why did the Ottoman Empire not have people supporting them outside of the Ottoman Empire?
Well, in terms of Muslim states, they were colonized. So how can they support the Ottomans?
So because of colonization, none of the Muslims, like you were saying, they'd be shot if they helped.
They weren't capable of doing it.
So in general, they were dependent already on the Ottoman state. They shifted dependency to colonial states, right?
So in the end, they tried to turn to the British and the French as support, because initially the war was thought to be a war that was going to be between the Russians and the Ottoman Empire in that sense. And they knew very quickly that the British and the French were not interested. They had no choice but to align themselves with the Germans and the Austrians in the hope that would be a buffer.
That's why the aligning with the Germans happened.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's so crazy, because traditionally looking at it, like the Austrian Empire was like mortal enemies.
Yeah.
I mean, going back to like
the reason why I'm talking about the allying with the Germans is a lot of people who talk about, then you realize why they're not specialists, is they say they failed, look, because they were going to the kuffar for help. But it's actually not exactly what it was.
So the idea was to create an alliance, not because you're going to go to war. It was an alliance to create a deterrent.
Yeah, to say we're powerful enough to withhold.
So the idea is, it was in nobody's imagination that World War I was going to take place. For the Ottomans, actually, the war starts before World War I in 1911 when the Italians invade Libya. Right? So the Italians invade Libya, and then the Ottomans lose the Balkan provinces because of the internal conflicts in the Balkan Wars. 2 times happened, and then 1914. And it's this domino effect. But never, ever, ever, because the Libyan War was 1 year, the Balkan Wars was like 6 months, 1 year. Never in their imagination did they think World War I is going to be this prolonged war where everybody's going to get involved.
So let me touch, since we're talking about this time period, let me touch on a controversial thing.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Russians.
Yeah.
And in my mind, while mentioning the Russians, we can't help but mention the Armenians. Right? People here, Armenians will say it's a genocide.
Right.
Me personally, I'm not too convinced. Right? I know people died.
Right.
But so before you answer that, let's just say this: what impact did this constant strife with the Russians? Because these were ongoing skirmishes that were happening, and the Russians, to my understanding, were actively trying to create or carve out communities outside of, like in Turkey, to branch out and create more autonomous Christian states. Right. So what role did that play in terms of putting stress on the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, it put a huge stress on the Ottoman Empire. They made the state quite paranoid in that context in regards to...
Who, the Ivans?
Sorry?
The Russians?
Yeah, exactly. The Russian involvement, it was huge. The main threat that the Ottomans had continuously was the Russians. It wasn't necessarily Britain and France in that context. They found a way of leveling out Britain and France. It was the main threat was the Russians, and that was something that the Ottomans struggled with. Now, going back to just quickly the World War I question, they didn't think that a war was going to take place. That's why they aligned with Germany and Austria. And so now it's very easy to say, well, you know, they shouldn't have aligned with them and they would have survived. But nobody anticipated the war of that nature. So that's where like this chat thing doesn't quite grasp that. That people didn't have the foresight to say this is what's going to happen, right? That just unfolded as things went across.
I see.
And then the British and the French get involved, because one of the interesting things is the assumption was that the Ottomans would be a buffer, so the Russians wouldn't advance, and the Germans would sort of like tit for tat with the Russians. Instead, the Germans did something interesting, which is they attacked the French first, which caught everyone by surprise, because the Ottomans didn't know that the Germans were going to do that. And by doing that, the French and the British, because the British were not supposed to get involved in the war, but anyone who attacks the French allowed the British to get involved, and then they came around. Interestingly, though, when the Bolshevik Revolution happens in 1917, and then in 1918, the Bolsheviks are the ones who expose Sykes-Picot, right? They step out of the war. The Ottomans then make the gains again in the the areas where the Russians made the advancements. The Ottomans took that back. They lost Palestine, however. One of the reasons is because they put their troops on one side, made them weaker on the other side. Because when the Americans got involved, so then the British turned to the Americans for extra help to help them in the war effort, which the Ottomans couldn't do. So this was the problem. So when people say that the Ottomans sort of like let down the Muslim world,
there were multiple fronts.
That's right. In fact, you could argue that the Muslim world was unable to support the Ottoman Empire.
Correct. So in order to save the seat of the empire, they had to shift forces, and that leaves the backside, so to speak, open.
That's right.
And they made their own alliances to take advantage of that.
And this is a moment of what we call alliances and the formation of international law, right? And international law is interesting at this time, because international law is fundamentally designed to encompass weak states. Strong states don't abide by international law. So America, when it invades Afghanistan, what's anyone going to do to it? When Russia invades Ukraine, what's anyone going to do to it? When the Israelis occupy Palestine, what's anyone going to do to it? They don't abide by international law because they don't have to. They're a strong state. But Pakistan needs to listen to international law. So you start to see that the idea of international law and the way that it's constructed at this moment in time is also an interesting thing, which the Ottomans have to work around as a way of trying to make sense of these configurations that are taking place in the world at the time, including places like China and Japan and whatnot. And in 1905, when the Japanese defeat the Russians in the war in Hokkaido, that is a game-changing moment, because everyone else thinks, okay, if the Japanese have defeated the Russians, then we can also achieve this. And that's why when the Ottomans go into the war, they're actually not that far behind. When you're reading about the war, one of the things you realize, it's like watching a boxing match where you don't really know who's going to win until somebody gets knocked out. And then when the person gets knocked out, you watch and you say, you know what? He was kind of weak in round one, and I knew he wasn't training properly. And so that's what happens. Do you understand?
Analogy. So you can kind of add both to yourself and say, I knew it was happening.
Yeah, that's right. I knew,
because of me.
Yeah, I knew he couldn't beat that guy.
Great analogy,
but so do you understand? So when you're moving forward, you don't actually see it. And as historians, the advantage we have, we know the outcome. Because we now know the end of the story, we can then go back in time and join dots together to facilitate that story. Then that's a little bit
But so
issue.
As you enter into that frame of thought, most Muslims, at least religious-minded Muslims, have given up on their respective nation states to come to the aid of Muslims, or that their alignment or their interests will be for the benefit of Muslims. It's anyone who's serious understands that there's no hope with these guys, that we have to work towards a caliphate in the future. That we have to set up the building blocks.
You mean
somehow. Inevitably, even though we may, whether it's possible now or not, that's debatable. But at least working towards that mission, that we're all in that, have that vision in place. In hindsight, as you see, as a historian, and you're able to connect those dots together to see those pain points, or those areas where the Ottomans made, they zigged instead of zagged, and are you able to construct some lessons learned for a future state? Because
Yeah,
you're
for
also an expert in nation state and statecraft. So
one of the interesting things, there was an academic, he's passed away, Palestinian academic, his name was Rifat Abu al-Hajj, and he said all the states that have emerged from the Ottoman Empire, all the nation states, they haven't succeeded in a nation state model, right? So both Muslim and non-Muslim. So if you look at the Balkans to the Muslim states, that all of them who have emerged nations, because it was an imposition upon them. It wasn't indigenous to the people at the time. So the nation state is something which is indigenous to Europe. It's a European construction, it's a European model imposed on the other nations to create a nation state which is unnatural to their environment. And you're starting to see a bleeding of lines and blurring of lines already in that sense. And the idea of Ummah is very interesting. The idea of migration is really interesting. The idea of globalization is quite interesting in that sense. And we see in Ottoman history, so I give an example, the collapse of the sacking of Baghdad is 1258, I think, or 1238. Anyway, Fatih's conquest of Istanbul is 1453. So imagine the 200 years. And then Selim's establishment of the Khilafah is 1517. So we're looking at a long span in which we see a shift take place. And some of these things are slow burns. Now, in modernity, it's very possible that just as quick as the nation states have arisen, they can equally collapse at the same speed. So we have a skewed understanding of time in that sense. But what's intriguing is while the nation states are struggling to maintain some sort of security over their borders because of the various wars in Syria and Iraq and whatnot, what's intriguing is the idea of having an alternative is still in the minds of the Muslims. So we look at Selim again, this is the example I give. Why were the Ottomans interested in establishing the Khilafah? Because the madrasa systems that emerged from the Seljuk madrasa systems were attached to a curricula where these ideas were being taught. So it's a maintenance of a memory. You maintain the memory, you make the you still vocalize it, you still say it, and then somewhere down the line when the conditions change, people establish it.
Yeah.
So here what you would argue is, maybe these nation states is another interregnum moment. Right? And this could be an interregnum moment where it could be 50, 60, 70, 100 years maybe. Maybe the nation states are a lot more robust and creative than we give them credit for. But long term, when you look at the way Muslims are thinking, it's not crazy to assume that there is a possibility that they could establish this institution again, because it's still relevant in their memory, and all it requires is a group of people who say, you know what, we like that idea and let's run with it. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to remove that from their memory. But the only way you can do that is to erase the historical past from their memory. Now, I'll give you another interesting example. So when Daesh made the claim that they have a Khilafah, the assumption is that modern Muslims in the West in particular, but Muslims everywhere, would abandon the idea of the Khilafah. They said, we're done with this. It's a violent mechanism. We're not interested. That's not what they did.
They didn't.
They turned around and said, that's not a Khilafah.
Exactly.
Right?
We mentioned that a few times. Yes.
So that caught people off guard.
Yeah.
And then they were saying, well, a Khilafah is. So then they were going back in history. What's intriguing about the ISIS in particular is they tried to get the imagination of an Abbasid Khilafah. So they spoke like Speako, but dressed in black robes, this, that, the other. But even they, because they were a product of Arab nationalism, were unable to handle the idea that Ottomans were here at one point. The idea of the Ottomans would have been an easier thing to digest, where people could have made more sense of it.
Jeez, I never thought about that.
So you create that
That's
huge
crazy.
disconnect, right, from people's memories. You create a huge blind spot, like this amnesia, where you skip 600 years and you jump to a moment when it makes sense to nobody. When it would be easier just to look at Sultan Abdul Hamid II.
So to that point, but also I think from an administrative standpoint, it would be more in line with what people were expecting anyways, right? Because the idea that the Ottoman Empire had a series of autonomous regions that had an obedience to symbolically or even some degree of influence from the top down, right?
Dude, when you go to the Middle East, everybody has that sense of nostalgic, missing, feeling indebted to the Turks. It would have been so much more strategic and easier.
Right.
Yeah.
Nothing's ever easy, right? But it would have been closer, mu'allafat al-qulub, you know, like closer to the heart.
So and the other thing, I just quickly observation is that it in fact had the opposite effect that maybe some of the detractors were probably hoping for, which is that, you know, instead of the idea of abandoning a potential khilafah, it was like, no, how about we have a conversation about what an actual khilafah looks like.
Exactly. And I tell you, it's interesting because we spoke about Dirlish Ertugrul. The interesting thing about that show is that Dirilish is not a Khalifa in that sense, but it's a reminder of people having an ideal of what a good ruler is. And what's intriguing about Dirilish, I always say to people, it's irrelevant whether the show is true or not. It's a reflection of how people feel. So it's a barometer of the audience, that the audience feel like we are searching for somebody who's upright, who's honest, who's brave, and so forth. And why, if Islam can tell them in terms of ethics and moralities and ideas about how to be with your neighbor, how to be with your family, why can it not inform my politics, right? Yeah. So you can see that the show did something interesting in that sense. Yeah. Even though it had nothing to do with the Khilafah, people are asking the question, can Islam be informative in regards to our politics? And this is where Ottoman history becomes interesting. Yes. Because there's a large corpus of works by the ulema throughout the various moments where they write ideas about this institution and criticisms of the institution, by the way. Of course. And criticisms of the Sultan. And both the pros and the cons are necessary, because then you start to grasp an idea of how could we imagine a possibility of a different type of future. Yes.
So can you expand a little bit about the Janissaries, meaning that obviously my understanding is that they eventually became the Young Turks, right? Or many of them, or I don't know, maybe I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is they were I guess you could say a slave class that kind of rose to the aristocratic society and developed that because they were highly educated, highly trained. And then I think from their circles, these ideas of maybe challenging or criticizing rule and policies. So who are the Janissaries and what role did they play eventually in the later part of the Ottoman Empire?
So the third Ottoman Sultan, Murat Hudavendigar, as he's moving into the Balkan provinces, one of the intriguing things is the advantage he has over the other Turkic states is they're kind of landlocked into each other, so they don't have, they can't just create men to fight. Whereas the advantage he had is he could keep going west into what they call Rumeli or Europe, and go to war with European states, and if they defeated those states, they can then take people in, right? What's intriguing is if a state surrendered, they would leave them alone. But if a state was defeated, then one male child, and the child here would have not been a child like a baby. That's too much of an investment. But maybe somebody who's 10, 11, 12 would be taken into a conscription system, which was known as the Janissary Corps. So the system was known as the Devshirme. They would be educated. Now the only education they can give them is Islam, because there is an Islamic entity. They would become Muslim, and then they would become part of this conscription unit in which they would be given a stipend. And it was a way of integrating the defeated peoples into the state structure as a way of having loyalty, because you have some agency now, because your son's in the army. Right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. I'll give you an example so you can understand better. When you watch Star Wars, it's the Padawan. You take the Padawan, you turn them into Jedi. Nobody gets shocked by that. You take these kids, you raise them, then they become the Jedi Order, and then they become an elite unit that sort of.
So it's like a mutual benefit.
Exactly. So now don't get me wrong. Like when you're defeated peoples, there is a sense of humiliation and so forth. Not everybody would have been happy about it, but in comparison to what the European states were doing to each other, which were taking absolute slaves and then just massacring each other, this was seen as an interesting mechanism, as a way. Because look, if you defeat a group of people, you need to put boots, as we say in the US, boots on ground. So they were not putting boots on the ground. Yeah. So the reason why they were not putting boots on the ground is because they had a policy not to agitate the elites, not to have forced conversion. When Muslims come into the area, keep them away from the city so they don't agitate the population, and have this system where we're going to take one child from every household. It's a good trade. They will go into the military, and in return, we'll give him a stipend. You can do what you want, pay your taxes, and we'll go back to normal. And you become a vassal state.
And it also serves as a deterrent, because you don't want to fight an army where your children are fighting in.
That's right. Now, so so in that sense, for that time, it's a sophisticated conscription system. And now the reason why I say conscription is because when you look at the U.S. Army today, everyone signs up a document that if there's wartime, you're going to be drafted in. Yeah. So it's similar to that, right? In that sense. Now, as time goes by the 17th century, in 1601 in particular, what you see is that the Ottoman state has changed. They've moved away from a culture of fratricide to a culture of seating the Sultan by being chosen. The ulema and the elites would choose this person. The reason being is because Mehmed III sort of like massacred 19 brothers, right? People went crazy, like, what's going on? So from now on, we're not going to do that. Sultan Ahmed, he's like 13 years old, and his brother Mustafa is 14. So the problem they have now is they can't kill Mustafa, because if they kill Mustafa, regarding fratricide, and Sultan Ahmed dies of sickness, Ottoman Empire is gone. No Ottoman dynasty. So they leave the two brothers. And as a result, you start to see the rise of a bureaucracy that's overseeing the House of Osman and now choosing the leader. And Mustafa, for the first time in Ottoman history, becomes a Khalifa after a brother. So that never happened before. Before, the brothers used to compete, and the first one to Istanbul became, whereas now it's one brother after the other, right?
Compete in what sense? Like to gain favor within the kingdom or the empire?
To become the leader of the state.
Yeah, but I mean, how would they compete? Was it? It wasn't like a duel or anything, was it?
Sometimes it was like there would be a race to Istanbul. So you would be put in various provinces, which were virtually equal distance, and then when the Sultan died, off you went, right?
Marathon.
Yeah, basically.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really intriguing. And
That's crazy.
the idea was from an old Turkic tradition that the survival of the fittest, the strongest, because you got to
They would send
understand.
them out to the mountains and to the to the
and
forest,
people say
right?
that's not Islamic, but understand what world they came from. They came from a world of the Mongol invasion. So this is a very violent world that they have entered and come up with. You cannot be weak in that type of world. You have to replicate the sort of culture that you've emerged in, right?
So it was like the urf almost, like this is what it was.
Exactly.
That,
But they change it themselves over a period of time, but it's a prolonged period of time. Now, going back to the Janissaries, by Sultan Osman, the son of Sultan Ahmed, and after Mustafa, the ulema and the Janissaries, they work together to unseat a Khalifa. And so they have the capacity now to choose a Khalifa and to unseat a Khalifa. The Janissaries become now a weight for the ulama, some way of putting on a Khalifa and taking off the Khalifa.
Kind of like a checks and balances.
Checks and balances, thank you very much. And this becomes what they call constitutional traditions in the Ottoman Empire.
This is really interesting because it seems to me that it looks like the early even Saudi state had maybe this kind of maybe envisioning that, because you know how they say that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab would be like the religious authority in the area, and they would have the
let's look at Pakistan and Turkey, with military coups always taking place, removing leaders from power, right?
Yeah.
So this is not new. And let's look at Jordan with a military establishment of Cherkess, Circassians, who are protecting the royal household. We still have these types of mechanisms in many countries around the world that can seat and unseat the ruler in that sense. And so in the Ottoman Empire, this is they had, now in 1826, Mahmud II, he wants to reform his army, create a new army, because the Janissaries, as a militia force and a military force, not only are dangerous in regards to being able to choose and unchoose a Khalifa, but also they're unable to now deal with the wars that are taking place in the European world. Because the intriguing thing about Europe is, when the Ottomans are in peacetime, they're not fighting. The Europeans are at war with each other, and the Ottomans are looking at them and saying, look at these crazy guys. They're fighting each other and we're in peacetime. But we call this a paradox of war. Meaning what? The more you fight, the better skilled you become at fighting. Do you understand?
experience.
Exactly. So the Europeans are fighting each other, improving, and creating new weapons. Where the Ottomans are in peacetime, alhamdulillah, we're not like those guys.
Become lazy.
But you fall behind.
Yeah.
So this is strange paradox you have. That on the one hand, so this is why still some people argue that modern Western states need to continuously create wars or facilitate wars to test that weaponry.
So you would say the Ottomans, if you could give them advice again retroactively, that they should have not entered into periods of peace, that they should have constantly been pushing their borders. And
but you know the problem with that, the reason why you need to have moments of peacetime is to consolidate Islam in people. So this is the thing. So when you have a population,
can you elaborate on that? What do you mean consolidation?
Well,
because you're spreading so fast.
I was thinking like maybe this may be the wisdom behind jihad al-talab, like that you continue like going forth, because otherwise you get stagnant.
It could be. I really don't know. But the idea is you keep expanding. So where's the Islam being taught?
Yeah.
And you keep needing people to keep fighting, right?
Because you need madrasas established.
That's right.
You need to have institutions so that the people can.
That's right.
And going back to your point about the how you explained that the Janissaries were a way to include people who were conquered and stuff. Was that? I mean, it seems like it was such a brilliant plan, and were there, in order to consolidate or effectively maintain their foothold on these regions that the Ottomans expanded into, did they not do enough of that? Maybe like they had these mechanisms like the Janissaries, but they needed more of that type of template where they integrated people like the Greeks or Romanians or other Eastern European countries into the state apparatus so that they can feel more like they're more included.
That happens in the early part of the Ottoman state. That's why they're successful. A shift happens when you conquer the Arab provinces. Now you have a totally different Ottoman state.
Because the Ottomans didn't like the Arabs because they had didn't like them, but they were worried about them coming into the government, at least from what I understand, because they have this tribal system, and then they want to, they start vying for power or wanting a say in that.
What's intriguing here is that when the Ottomans become a Khilafah, the ideas of the Khilafah come from the Mamluki ideas of the Madrasa and seep their way into Istanbul. So that culture does come into play. And the Ottomans in the latter period, for sure, worked exceptionally hard to integrate Arabs into Istanbul because they knew that was necessary. So you do see this shift. But the problem, or the early part, is when you become a state that big. So you have a model that works like that, but nobody had the imagination that we'll go down.
Yeah.
So nobody thought the Ottomans would ever come down to Mamluki Cairo.
They thought it might just shift power, maybe,
That's right.
but it wouldn't just completely collapse.
Because look, you understand this Fatih is 1453 and Selim is 1517. That's a large gap. So if I asked you today, in 60, 70 years' time, can you see Syria, Iraq, and Turkey becoming one country? It's unimaginable.
Yeah.
But it's the same time frame. Do you understand?
Yeah.
And in modernity, what's interesting is we can imagine new states being formed by splitting apart. We're not allowed to imagine states coming together.
Right.
We're not given that imagination. If you imagine that, you're crazy. Stop it. So in that time in history, you see that they probably didn't have these imaginations that it was going to happen. But once these things happen, it creates new problems, new issues. So it's management. It's guacamole.
But I think that at the same time, though, it was much more imaginable because the idea of borders and these were far less of a concrete idea.
That's right.
Now the gift of nationalism is that it's impossible to see that somebody would concede or merge lands.
That's right.
But wasn't there kind of this attitude, even prior to the decline, that the Arabs were incapable of ruling just because there was too much infighting, and it was like a policy? Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there some policy of like the Ottomans going there and marrying into them, like so their children would then be Turkish, and it was kind of like...
It wasn't seen as an issue that the Arabs were incompetent. That wasn't the idea. It's just that when you think about it, yes, it's an empire and so forth, but in many ways, people are very local. So I give you an example. I joke about moon sighting all the time in London because we can never agree.
Yeah, same here.
Same here in Chicago.
Okay,
Yeah.
But in the Ottoman Empire, they were doing Eid on different days.
Yeah.
Right? Because different cities saw the moon on different days. And by the time Istanbul told Cairo that we've seen the moon today, it's gone. So intriguingly enough, in those days, they just didn't take it.
Even with the telegraph?
That happens a lot later. So the telegraph is a lot later. But we're talking about the earlier period, right? In that sense. But even with the telegraph, the Ottomans are not that obsessed with we need to do Eid on one day.
Because the idea of autonomy. So it wasn't something that they had to force down a rule on everybody.
Exactly.
As long as you were loyal to the state.
But the point I'm making is about locality, right? People were very local in their imagination. The shift in regards to thinking global was the printed press. Where now you have newspapers. You're reading about somebody in India. You're reading about somebody in Cairo. You're reading about... Prior to that imagination, you knew that Cairo existed. But what's happening in day-to-day life in Cairo, somebody in Istanbul didn't care. So Istanbul in some way was an enclave. And this is why you can see Ottoman studies being very Istanbul-centered when they're talking about the Sultanate. But the machinery of empire is a series of negotiations. So a way of understanding this, Star Wars, Game of Thrones, One Piece and manga, Naruto, these are world building. Yeah. People love world building, right? And when you watch these shows, you understand the complexity of how world building operates. Yeah. People don't understand that's how the Ottoman Empire is. It's a giant world, and if you looked at it in that context, Game of Thrones is interesting in that sense. When we watch it in Turkey, it's like clean version.
So it's a huge chessboard.
That's right. It's a huge chessboard.
So just coming back to the original, for previous question. Yeah. So when were the Janissaries sort of disbanded then, or
1826?
And did members that were other Janissaries become or involved with the Young Turks at all?
No. So so the Young Turks emerge in sort of like 1890 and so forth. The Janissaries are disbanded in 1826 because they were seen as an obstacle for military reformation. Now the reason why the Janissaries were not reforming is because they were turning around and saying, listen, we know what the Sultan is trying to do. He's trying to remove us from power because we put him off in power, so we're not going anywhere. Sultan Mahmud is saying, listen, if we don't deal with this Janissary question now, we're going to get blitzed by the Europeans. So one of the ways that the Ottomans were fighting wars is usually, it would be a local, if let's just say they invaded Cairo, it would be the armies in Cairo that would defend Cairo, and then the neighboring areas would send troops into to fill up the fort, and then maybe Istanbul would send extra troops to help them. That's a different, because look at the nature of the empire, whereas the British and the French didn't have to do that. They had a very different way of warfare. So then the Ottomans had to change the army quick by saying, we need to learn drills, we need to learn machines. So even like the fez, right? When Mahmud II brings the fez in, imagine going to war with a giant turban, and people pop you off just like that. So they're saying, listen, we need to change the uniform. People going, what are you talking about? It's haram, yani. So you have these type of complexities in the empire that then he has to force it by brute force and becomes exceptionally unpopular for doing it, because in Islam we don't like the idea of a ruler being so aggressive. He needed money for his army, so he started confiscating waqfs, taxing people and so forth by saying, listen, we need money. So people go, it's haram, you can't do that. So then what do? They have to take loans from the banks, because they can't tax their people, they can't squeeze their people like colonialism, and they can't confiscate waqfs. So you see the complexity.
By the bank, do you mean was the IMF at this time started? Or
no, but they were taking loans from the French and British banks at the time, right?
So those banks, okay.
So this is why that happens. So what I'm saying to you is, yes, people can say it's a mistake and not, but what they're competing with is basically a game or playing field where they're not making the rules anymore, and they have to close the gap with a set of rules which is unfair to the people they compete with. Once again, two boxers, and one boxer has like metal in his fists, and the other guy's coming clean and saying we're ready to roll, and he's just getting pummeled. And then the Muslims are saying, yeah, you got to just be good, because that's not allowed. We go, well, how am I going to defeat this guy? So then you have to think of creative ways of doing that, and that was hard. And so in some ways, yes, we should critique them, but some ways we need to understand that this was difficult. And so this requires a different type of thinking. And going forward to your question, then going forward, how would you deal with things like that, where you have a moral and ethical standard in the way that you do conscription, you have a moral and ethical standard in the way you do taxation, you have a moral and ethical standard in the terms that you do warfare, and the other side doesn't abide by that. It has a standard where we can do anything and everything. Going forward, how do you make sense of that? What would you do? And I think that's one of the complexities, that when you look at Ottoman history, you realize, okay, you know, a non-colonial entity competing with colonial entities was hard. I'm not saying they were perfect. In some ways, Mahmud needed to be, in his eyes, a autocratic modernizer. But there were consequences of that, where Mehmed Ali Pasha turned against him because he could see what was happening and said, I'm not going to be next. So instead he rebels against him, and then you have an internal rebellion. So how do you make sense of these, once again, you know, pieces moving? And this is the hard thing, that when you look at governance of empire, the complexity is this. So people just think Khilafah, and then Allahu Akbar, everyone's just going to follow you. Muslims are not just going to follow you.
That's true.
You don't just take obedience because you feel like you deserve it. You have to continuously, over generation and generation, earn it. And each generation is different.
It's a meritocracy.
That's right. And each generation, like today, the young generation, when we look at them, they're very different than our generation, right? And so these generational shifts, the leadership has to move along with the generation. And the fact that they were able to do that for 600 years or 400 years in terms of Khilafah is extraordinary. And that is an interesting point. Like, I accept the weakness and the collapse. But for me as a historian, I'm aware of that. What I want to see is extraordinary moments.
Yeah.
What can we take from that? Right? Because Muslims keep asking me questions like, can you prove or disprove this? I'm tired of this.
Yeah.
Why have we become like that the history books say this, can you prove this happened? Stop. Khalas, yani. We don't have to be that insecure that I continuously need to prove or disprove. Just go into your history and ask different questions. What do you want to know? Rather than being defensive and continuously responding because you have a moral sort of like framework that you're imposing in the past. So we need to do history differently.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I asked about the Armenian genocide is because they, you know, we have a pretty large Armenian population here in Chicago too, right? And I was crying about genocide. And I've done my own research. And I'm not entirely convinced. right? I'm not like, I'm just saying, like, you know, the way I look at it, I'm going to put it in a very simple form, the way I understand it. If you have a population of people inside the Ottoman Empire and they're trying to side with the foreign empire, that's game for getting squashed. Like, I mean, imagine if, like, Texas decided, you know what, America, we're going to go over to Mexico now. And America would come down like the iron fist on them. There's no way to allow them to cede from the Union,
well,
right?
This is the interesting thing, which is the Armenian question is not my area of expertise. I just chose not to take an interest in it. But what you can see is that there are complexities on both sides, and the word genocide has continuously shifted and moved as politics has shifted and moved. And this is an issue that nowadays is less about history and more about politics.
Yeah.
And this seems to be the problem here.
It's a feel-good moment. Oh, we stand against the genocide. We're here.
So,
we're there. Yeah.
In reality, as a historian myself, I don't think I can contribute anything to this without getting involved in the political debate. So I've just opted out.
Right, right. So, is it also true, though, coming back to the Russians, though, it does, I could be wrong here, but it seems to me that the kind of a same situation with Azerbaijan, where they wanted to kind of disconnect the Ottoman Empire from the Muslims that were in Russia or the Caucasus, that region. Is that fair to say that they carved out Azerbaijan for that, or Armenia for that region too? Like, I mean,
I'm not sure if they carved out Armenia for that reason, to be honest with you. But the Russians are very interesting in the way that the Soviet Union operated, and that Soviet Union model is really fascinating. And that if you look at the way that they had all these states as buffers around Russia, and they sort of have a sort of allegiance over them, and even now, when you see in the war in Ukraine, it's almost like the Russians have a historical memory that they don't want to lose their sphere of influence. Like if Ukraine goes, then others will follow like dominoes. So we're going to go all in, irrespective, right? In that sense. And that's fascinating. What's even more fascinating is when you look at World War I and how that happens. The war in Ukraine is not that far off from that. It takes I said to you, the Ottomans, 1911, 1912, 13, 14, bang. So when you look at Ukraine, it's just been 1 year. In 2, 3, 4 years, what if Belarus gets involved? Poland, so Germany, bang! We're in trouble again.
Like,
Exactly. And this is what I think we can feel that in the region.
Yeah.
Because people in the region have a historical memory, they're aware of things, so they know. Whereas in America, nobody really cares because everyone's just eating donuts. But
we don't feel we don't feel the impact of that.
No, you don't.
And there's
sadly, that's true.
There's no historical tie to it. Like, this is part of the Soviet Union at one point, where people felt like, people don't realize, or young people don't realize, that a part of Germany was part of the Soviet Union. That's how large the empire was, right?
I mean, like, you have East and West Germany. I mean, the Crimea was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
The Crimea was part of... So at the moment, the narrative is Ukraine and Russia.
Even places like Dagestan and Chechnya, the Avars, the Imam Shamil, they were kind of still loyal to the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, and they come, like a lot of people move from the Caucasus into the Ottoman Empire after the fall of the Crimea, in that sense.
Yeah.
What's intriguing in 1774, which is an interesting question, it happens in Bosnia and it happens in the Crimea in that sense, that when the Crimea is lost, the ulema in particular become conflicted. Some of them say, let's make hijrah, and some of them say, this is our home. And it's the first time that the Ottomans have lost Muslim domains. So it's a huge shock to the system. And so the ones that say it's fard to make hijrah, is because now the non-Muslims have these areas. We can't live here anymore. And the ones who say, no, we must stay, I say, if we leave, then all remnants of Islam will be lost here.
There's no hope.
There's no hope.
Yeah.
And the hope is that the Ottomans will come back in the future one day, which they never do. But that's, once again, what their imagination is.
But that same question is still today.
Exactly.
Like, do the Muslims just abandon Palestine for the moment and regroup, or do they stay and fight? Right. The same dynamic, the paradigms are still there today.
Totally. And you can see that. And that's intriguing. And so then the idea is fascinating, which is the Ottomans are stuck. Because the Ottomans viewed the world as the Ummah in the Khilafah and the Ummah outside the Khilafah. The Ummah in the Khilafah are within our jurisdiction. The Ummah outside can't do much for you, but we'll try our best.
See
Andalus,
for example.
Right. But then with the Crimea, are they Ummah inside the Khilafah or outside? How did they fit? Because they used to be part of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
So it creates a moment in their mind and a theological discussion, which is complicated.
But I think the Muslims would always say, no matter what that question and answer is, we'd rather be part of the Muslims than not be, right?
Okay, so this is why many of them, let's just migrate.
Yeah.
And actually then the reform that's taking place in the Ottoman military are Russian Muslims coming from the Caucasus, convincing Istanbul that if you don't reform your military, those Russians are going to come for us. Do something. But the people at the time who were there saying, listen, we need to maintain the status quo. You're just paranoid because you lost the war. We don't need to do this right now. So you see, even internally, like hawks and doves, you know, which is once again, so people always say, why didn't Ottomans just do that? But local dynamics and politics doesn't always allow it to be that straightforward.
Yeah.
So,
well, you know, in regards to Andalus, they couldn't help out, but they benefited tremendously, right?
Yeah.
Because all the people who were who left during the Reconquista, they came to the Ottoman state, or many of the brightest minds came to the Ottoman state, and they benefited. At least the state became stronger from it.
And you know, that's a really fascinating idea, because that's what the United States of America does.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily build the best minds, it takes the best minds.
Yeah.
So when you go to the universities, the Ivy League universities, you see minds from all over the world in these Ivy League universities. Nation states don't do that. They don't allow that. They will not allow, nation states will not allow an Arnold Schwarzenegger to be the governor of California, right? Whereas the United States of America allows that. And that's because this is empire.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I mean, the only way they can grow is by absorbing these populations and making them part of the system. I do want to get to some questions. Some people ask some interesting ones. This is one that's I found, I was just caught my eye. Could Dr. Yakoob explain the practice of killing brothers that was allegedly legalized by Sultan Mehmed Fatih? What was the rationale, and how did the ulema view this practice?
Yeah, so once again, this is the question that keeps getting asked, right? And look, the idea of fratricide is not a one-size-fits-all. So it wasn't like, I'm going to do fratricide and everyone needs to do fratricide. The issue is in Fatih's time, in order to create unity, it starts in Fatih's time where he legitimizes it. And then in various moments, at different moments in Ottoman history, different contestations take place between different brothers. In the earlier period where you see with Bayezid and Jem, the two brothers sort of have it out with each other, and then Jem escapes, and then he dies in Europe. In other instances, when, for example, Bayezid II was alive, that Selim went to war with his brothers while his father was alive. So that happened. So the idea was to stop this sort of like internal infighting, because it would collapse the empire. Or, so the first thing would to stop a rebellion. The second thing was to stop the possibility of rebellion. And the third thing, which is a lot more dubious, which is in the future, this person has the capacity to create a rebellion. Yeah. So it was an issue of legitimacy. Now, as I said, by the time of Mehmed III, he kills 19 brothers and sisters. And then the ulema just go, okay, stop. So initially, they sort of accepted it as a necessary evil.
Did they say stop to him, or did they say stop to the next caliph because they were too scared to say it to him?
Across the board, yeah. They wouldn't have said it to him in that sense.
Because he would have killed them, yeah.
So one could argue that this was what we could say probably kufr dun kufr. Like for them, they were like, hey, either the state falls or you kill somebody.
So this is an interesting thing. So when they were having children early on, one of the cultural things was that you had, the minute you had a son with a woman, you couldn't have any more children. So for example, if you had 4 daughters from a woman and then you had a son, that's it, you stop.
Is it?
If the first child was a son, then you stop. Okay? As a way of trying to limit the possibility of having many sons that are going to contest. But you need to still have sons to maintain the dynasty.
Of course.
So what was the largest Ottoman harem?
In terms of that, you know, the number of that, I don't know, because this is now another Orientalist trope. You know, Orientalists sort of make all sorts of numbers up, but the harem structure in particular, if we're going to get serious on that, is the idea that the Ottoman Sultan earlier, like Fatih and so forth, was marrying princesses, right?
Of course it's a good idea.
Okay. But you know what I mean? He's marrying princesses. Now, when that system stops, how do you marry a sultan?
Yeah.
So what they chose was to marry or to have children with concubines, because she had no lineage. Because if she had a father or an uncle, he could contest power.
So a son from that relation could not contest for, or cannot be eligible to be a sultan?
No, he could be eligible to be sultan. But if she had a father or brother or uncle, then that family background could contest the Ottoman Sultanate.
Oh, so it would strengthen or weaken the case for...
That's right.
So basically orphan women?
So
women who were basically
they didn't have any background
Yeah.
and so on, and that's how they operate.
So pretty much obscure women. So if you look at their history, you probably wouldn't know much about.
That's right.
But if you
history.
think about it, this is a brilliant strategy.
Yeah,
It's
because
so brilliant.
women that need help.
But people don't think
Yeah.
about these things that are related to the Ottoman state. How much thought they put in
Yeah.
to all these different mechanisms, because the state needs to be strong, and the state has to have security, and shouldn't have to feel like there's always internal threats.
That's right.
Even despite all that, they still had problems that happened. But I can imagine if they didn't have these things in place, how quickly the state would have
So
collapsed.
one of the things that people need to appreciate when they're doing history, this is what I'm saying, you need to understand those mechanisms for that time. Understand the world at that time
Exactly.
in comparison to the whole world around them.
Yeah.
Right?
That's
It's
justice,
not in
yes.
comparison to today. It's in comparison to the whole world around them in terms of what's happening. Now, people then say, yeah, but we judge them by the standards of Islam. And that's right. What I'm saying is that when it's civilizational, it doesn't happen overnight. So when you enter a world where the sort of it's predicated by extreme violence, then what happens is as you're building your state, you still have the remnants of violence in you. And so, for example, people will say, certain Pakistanis have behaviors which are very similar to pagans in India, because we're civilizational builders, not civilizational destroyers. So we build on ideas, and then you hope that over a period of time, those erroneous ideas phase out by themselves. When you're looking at empire building, you don't have the time to sieve and weed in everyone. You don't have that.
That's
and when
true.
you're state building, that's not how people are working. It's gradually over time. You educate, and conditions are changing. The violence and wars and whatnot, and they keep moving and they keep
So
moving.
I see that as the way, to be honest, the way the Sahaba did things too. Like when they would conquer a land, they didn't go out begging people to change their behavior. They would establish a masjid and the law, number one, in the masjid, and whoever wanted to learn about Islam would come there, but the law was naturally then put into place because it then made it conducive for that generation or future generations to then adopt Islam. Because if you look at Sham, it took almost 300-400 years for it to become majority Muslim. Right? For a long time, it was still non-Muslims and people still coming.
Was it that long? I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
about 300 years, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting
SubhanAllah.
here? Do you see this in the Ottoman Empire, that when the Ottomans were in power, the majority of the people were not Muslims. So somebody once asked me, can you do a history of Muslims as minorities? And I joked, and I said, well, the Ottomans were minorities.
Yeah, because
I didn't know that.
why didn't they focus on regions like Serbia so much? And that's one of the questions that's always plagues me. It's like they had so much influence and control in that region. I mean, what is it? Something just related to the Serbian fervor or the religious fervor?
They didn't believe in forced conversions. And when you look at Anatolia, people, majority Muslims in Anatolia, because there were Turkic entities and Mongol entities prior to the Ottomans. That had become mainly Muslim prior to the Ottomans in that context. So this is years of different types of people, including the Mongols, right? So if you go to Tokat...
The previous Turkic
That's
people
right.
came in.
So if you go to Tokat, there's a Mongol madrasa there, which people don't realize in that context. One of the things I want to say, which is going to sound kind of crazy, but
Say it, brother.
people need to have a better understanding of studying the history of violence. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Because I think people don't actually quite understand what violence is, what war is. And so if they need to understand the nature of what violence is when we're looking at this empire, because people just war, fight, kill, but human beings are violent beings. There's innate in human beings. And when you're looking at these state configurations and so forth, there's even now when we're looking at wars and whatnot, you need to understand the nature of violence in a way of understanding how these states are then evolving into what they're becoming.
I mean, the way I look at it is that every nation has violence, but they choose history, and at the current time, they choose to justify it in different ways.
Yeah.
Right? Like, for example, America can cry about 3,000 people that died, but they can take out 1.2 million babies in some place for sanctions, right?
Yeah,
And it's justified. It's patriotic, right? So empires will always view. I mean, violence has always been something which is part of empires, right?
Yeah.
This stand keeps.
That's third time.
Bro, there's a...
They say a person should learn from the past, you know?
Yeah. Anyways, the point being though is that no, the reality is though there was a question though. So What was the jizya like during that time period? I mean, I'm sure that it was probably really flexible depending on who was in power, right?
Jizya is tax.
Yeah. So it's.
By
just
the way, I have a shirt that says jizya collector.
Oh really?
Yeah, it has an AK, a silhouette of an AK. So I'm ready for the Ottomans to come back.
So they have an interesting understanding of the idea of the jizya, and as you said, it's a particular form of taxation which they use on non-Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, but it's a nominal fee. But they find other mechanisms as a way of encouraging people to become Muslim. So they use incentive schemes rather than for people to become Muslim. Now, what's interesting in the latter period of the Ottoman Empire, non-Muslims who are encouraged to become part of the military, because there's only a certain amount of Muslims you have in the military, and you've got an empire where the majority of people are non-Muslims, so you need to find a way of having non-Muslims in your armed forces. Because the burden on Muslims was heavy to maintain the dawla, by the way. You're paying heavy taxes and trying to maintain this state of yours. Non-Muslims are only paying jizya and whatnot. You got to find a different way of like circumventing this. So they removed the jizya from non-Muslims who joined the army because you're putting your life on the line. And that's been a really interesting conversation that people have had, whether this is jaiz or not, right? But you see that. So this is an intriguing thing. So when I talked about the bank loans, they had interest on that. And when we're talking about the jizya, so people look at this and say, how's that possible? Yeah. But I'm trying to give you context so you can understand why it happened.
I look at this like a period where there was dire situations and you need to come up with solutions. Because to me, the utmost importance is you keep the state running. Right? These are some, people don't realize, but these are some of the important things, like, for example, going back to the death of Rasulullah. They delayed the burial until they could determine definitively who the Khalif would be. Because it was that important to, rather than, because
falling into shambles,
right? And that fitna that comes from that, which is obviously evident now, right? Like we can see the byproduct of the Khilafah, falling, just disintegrating. But what were the Muslims living under, like under the Ottomans? Were there any additional fees or taxes that were imposed because of this dire situation, aside from just like jizya? I'm sorry, zakah?
There was various land taxes that people had to pay and things like that. So there were various mechanisms that they used to extract taxes from people in that context. One of the intriguing things that you see in the Ottomans and where they're struggling is the Ottomans, it would have been impossible for the Ottomans to imagine the idea or invent capitalism. Capitalism could not have come from the Muslims. It was just not part of the Muslim mindset. You understand? So this is another problem that they have, that the world is now becoming capitalistic. But Islam would never have allowed the idea of capitalism to emerge from its own mindset.
The kind of capitalism that they wanted in the West.
That's right. Right. But so now we have a situation again.
Because there was a free market system in the Ottomans, right? But it wasn't the kind, the exploitative one where...
And the majority of the trade prior to the 19th century was internal. So it was internal trade that was taking place.
Much like the British Empire. They had they just within the Commonwealth.
But then when the British expand and are trading around the world, the Ottomans are struggling with that in that context. And then machines come along, and machines do a lot of things in terms of hurting trade in the Ottoman domains.
So somebody had a question that in the audience. What was the relations between the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire?
Oh, this is something I want to ask you about as well, because in hindsight, as we look at the Ottomans, as you mentioned, that they didn't have that much support from other Muslims. Again, is that one of these trajectories that they could have done a better job, maybe make more effort in establishing relations and strengthening the ties with the Mughals and India in general? So
they did strengthen their ties with India, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, but they could do nothing to support
But was that too late? Was that too late?
I mean, it's interesting now looking back at it and saying, was it too late? I mean, I don't think that was their
Could the state have been more powerful had they established relations with them earlier on, and then I know it's just all like, what we call in America Monday morning quarterbacking, where we talk about the game on the weekend. So basically, had they had that weight of powerful Muslim entities, whether it's even from the Mughals or elsewhere. So prior to the 18th century, we don't have a culture globally of creating coalitions. Coalition creation with other states was not part of the imagination, right?
So nobody was doing that at the time. So there's no reason for the Ottomans to think, let's go into coalition with the Mughals, because one day the British are going to come along and colonize you, and then we're going to be in trouble. Coalition construction happens because European states in particular start to create coalitions amongst each other so that they don't fight each other. Then when they colonize in other nations, which include Muslim nations, the Ottomans can't quickly say, go send someone over and tell them to stop and don't be. Nobody saw that coming, because the Indians didn't see it coming, that the British were going to come with a trumpet and take over the country. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's a bit unfair to assume that they could have second-guessed some of these things.
So, I mean, it's also seen as somewhat in power dynamics, right? Where like the state that could not even potentially fathom that it was going to end, why would it be looking to...
And they didn't fathom it was going to end. Like when you look at the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 and 1909, it's written in the constitution that the Ottoman Empire is going to be the Islamic Caliphate until the end of time. Yeah. So their assumption was, we're going to keep going until the end of time. Now, what's intriguing here is that the Quranic principle is nothing remains forever.
Yeah.
So in actuality, the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate is a reflection of a Quranic principle that we should actually understand. Now, they didn't have that imagination, so they're thinking we're going to keep going. And then when it collapses, you see the ulema just like really despondent in terms of what happened.
Yeah.
Right?
When they believed
you
that,
can't blame them for 700 years.
Yeah,
Right?
600 years, yeah.
But when they believed that, I don't know if I'm nitpicking, when they believed that it would continue till the end of time, was it in the sense of pompousness and arrogance, or was it that we can't have it any other way?
They didn't know anything else. Who thinks of their demise? Who thinks of... We're in the United States of America. Could you imagine me telling you that in 10 years' time this whole state's not going to be here? You just wouldn't imagine it. Now, in the Muslim world, where the nation states are, because currently with the Arab Spring and so forth, we're seeing some strange stuff. In the Balkans, with the Balkanization, we see that... So the state of Turkey can imagine that their borders are under threat, that things can happen to them, because they've seen it happen to their neighbors. Saudi Arabia can see it and can imagine it, right? In that sense. So you can see, in that sense, that's... But here, in this nation here, could you imagine telling them that, the state of Texas is going to be independent? That Alaska doesn't want to be part of you anymore? That Hawaii wants independence? You just can't imagine that, right?
Yeah.
And so for the Ottomans, in that sense, they're an empire. They couldn't, even though they're losing states on the frontier regions and so forth.
Yeah.
They're still thinking, we can maintain this, we can save this, we can find a way of pulling together. We just need to buy time. We just need to get through this difficult moment in that sense. And I use this football analogy in terms of I support Liverpool. We're all saying we're struggling right now. Just need to get through this season. The next season we'll be back. Right?
Keep the hope alive.
That's right.
So, So I think anything's fathomable now when ذكرك الأنثى. The verses is ليس ذكرك الأنثى, but now we can fathom anything. So if you were to tell me 10 years from now Texas is gone,
there was one really interesting question I wanted to ask. Someone actually reminded me in the TikTok chat. Did the Ottoman Empire have any insight or intelligence regarding the massive amounts of oil that the Gulf essentially had?
They had, in the latter period, ideas that there are forms of oil in parts of the Arab world. But to that extent, and to the extent that they would have known that was going to be a game changer, I don't think they were aware of that.
I think it's quite obvious they didn't, because if they did know, they would have made because I think majority of the Ottoman investments were made within the Hijaz.
Yeah, that's right.
That could have saved, right? I mean, in terms of the amount of money, if had the... I mean, this is all... What
and
if
then the Ottomans will then start eating burgers, become fat, and become lazy.
That would have been...
We're not all like that, okay?
But speaking of, talking about nation states and academia and Ottoman history, and just on, if we can just, I was always curious about you being a professor in Turkey. What type of autonomy do you have to talk about whatever you want, even though it may seem very critical? Even though as a historian you're not intentionally being critical about anything, you're just speaking what you've researched. It's strictly academic.
So I'm given the freedom to say and do whatever I want. I know, look, all human beings have a sense of censorship.
Yes.
Everyone does that. And you learn as you get older to be smarter. Like, I mean, in that sense, you learn what ought to be taught, what not to be taught. And in that sense, when I'm teaching Ottoman history, honestly speaking, nobody's ever stopped me in terms of that. The key is like some of the questions you're asking about how you can use the past as a way of creating particular imaginations about the present and the future. That is an interesting question in that sense, because that's where history becomes interesting, right? And so this is why I teach it, because my argument is that I'm not going to tell you what what your future ought to be. You need to determine that. But I'm going to teach you what we did in the past and what can you take from it. What do you want to take from it?
That's beautiful, yeah.
Right? So one of my critiques of Western academia in particular is I'm not talking about individual academics. I'm talking about the machinery. So Western academia, so Ottoman history is a Western enterprise. Muslims didn't do Ottoman history. It's a Western, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, SOAS, Oxford. These are the institutions that it created this idea of Ottoman studies, right? And then they have what you see is the machinery, which I call. It writes about the Islamic past and tells Muslims who they were, who they are, and who they ought to be. That's a problem for me. So I'm in the machinery. I get it. I struggle in the machinery, and there are many good Ottoman historians who are non-Muslims and Muslims, and that's not the point. The point is the discipline itself, which does produce wonderful works, but the problem is that the framework in which it comes from, Muslims can't make sense of why does this matter to me, apart from an intellectual exercise.
I see.
So you understand?
So what in academia?
Yeah.
What is the intended opinion or viewpoint they want to push out about the Ottoman Empire?
I don't think there's one viewpoint, and this is the thing. It's just an industry where you continue to revive stuff, continue to critique each other. It's a career. Write a pamphlet about this. Write
So I see what you're saying. Essentially, like that conversation doesn't really benefit the majority of people because it's just simply the academic process of critiquing and finding out more information.
Now, history writing is an intellectual endeavor. Bernard Lewis was a historian who was given advice to the Bush administration. Bernard Lewis was given advice when Albert Hourani was an academic and a historian, an Arab Christian. Bernard Lewis was a Jewish academic on Islamic history. And when Albert Hourani was giving us advice for the Americans regarding the Palestinians, they took advice from Bernard Lewis, right? So historians have that level of agency and power in which they can tell governments and create ideologies and narratives.
Well, they contribute to think tanks like RAND and places like this, where George Washington University, where they then influence policymakers.
So we make the argument that social science historians don't need to learn political science, but political scientists
historians don't what?
Don't need to learn political science, but political scientists need to learn history.
I see.
Do you understand?
Does Erdogan or the Turkish government talk to you about things?
No, I mean, I'm part of the machinery.
Yeah.
We have these type of conversations all the time, and everyone has a particular conversation in terms of what's going on and whatnot. I think the Turkish state knows what it's doing. I generally am a thinker who I'm a recluse and stay at home and mind my own business. But in some ways, I'm appreciative of the fact that they have given me enough respect to let me do what I'm doing in terms of my teaching, which is that. I mean, I generally don't even teach Ottoman history in Turkey. I teach Islamic history.
Is it?
Yeah.
So you have a really direct focus that's kind of independent of what those academic conversations are and what the Turkish directive may be. You're kind of more, hey, I'm here just to teach Islamic history, and I'm taking advantage of the benefit that I can teach non-Muslims about Islam in a way.
Yeah, I teach Sirah.
What do the Turks say when they think when you made the claim of being a specialist in Ottoman history?
So when I first went there, they just said, why didn't you do Pakistani history? And what's interesting is I had to prove myself twice as much that I deserve to be here. But now I'm accepted as being there. I mean,
are you a Turkish citizen?
No, not yet. That is something that I was saying. I'm still having this conversation about whether I should do it or not and whatnot. A lot of my Turkish colleagues want me to do it, and they want me to stay in the country because fundamentally, when I moved to Turkey, I did not move for money or any of prestige or, so forth. I fundamentally moved because as a Muslim, I wanted to give something back to the Muslim community, right? And I remember a friend of mine who was from Pakistan who said, don't you feel ashamed, Pakistani British, don't you feel ashamed of abandoning Muslims in Britain? I said, did you ask your father that question when he left Pakistan? Like, it's an unfair question. Like, the Ummah is the Ummah, yani. When I come to England, I do what I can, but I believe that in the Muslim world, that if they need the agency of intellectuals and thinkers that can help improve the Muslim world. The difficulty in the Muslim world is the saying of Imam Ali radiallahu anh, when it's the idea of be the fragrance of the flower to even the hand that crushes it. And he said that at a time when he was, you know, in the height, the hand that crushed him was Muslims. So you understand that when you're in a Muslim country, you have to be able to accept the fact that it's not going to be easy there. But that's not the point, because you have to be Akhira orientated, right?
I mean, I think I'm a big proponent of that. Like, you know, Muslims need to start, because
you know, a lot of people, I know what you're saying, because a lot of people talk about, the Turkish nationalism. They point to secular Turks and to say, oh, look, you know, they don't care about Islam. And we know about the, you know, there's religious Turks as well, but sometimes people will try to incite some kind of fervor in you to distance yourself from Turkey or whatever country. Sometimes it's for about Palestine, like local Palestinians don't care about Kashmir or Bangladesh or the Myanmar or whatever. So is that what you're asking?
No. I was going to say this. I mean, not asking, but I was going to say more like this. I do think that, when Muslims first moved to the Western world, or whatever they call the modern Western world, I don't think the early generation had this idea that this would be the permanent homeland. It eventually became that, because the idea and the dream of actualizing a successful, economically prosperous state just seemed to dwindle, right? Just like, okay, it's not there. Our kids are adapted here. We're probably not going to, because many immigrant parents actually built homes back home, right? They're like, oh, we're going to go visit. We're going to go here, invest, buy some property, retire there. But that dream just kind of goes away, because you kind of get engulfed in like this Western lifestyle, whether it be capitalism, whatever. But the point that I'm making is that I think that if Muslims have an opportunity, they should go to places like Turkey, where they can thrive and benefit. But at the same time, I think Muslim governments, if they truly want to be successful, they have to have an open door policy for qualified, achieve, Muslims who have achievements to come and set up, whether it be in academia or in business or whatever, even in government, right? But you have to provide that opportunity. I think that's really important, because we're never going to get past where we are right now if we don't.
My concern in regards to what could happen in the West, and I could be wrong, and I'm sure many people would disagree with me, but this is my concern, that there was forms of violence used in Andalusia against Muslims that eradicated Islam from the identity of the people. There are forms of violence used in transatlantic slave trade, right? In the West now, they're using different mechanisms of violence, which is legal violence, intellectual violence, cultural violence, as a way of gradually, over a prolonged period of time, 4, 5, 6 generations, can you be comfortable with saying that it's possible that those generations will be Muslim, right? That's what happened. So if you look at the Ottoman Empire, people lived under Islam, and you would see various communities, large communities like Albanians, Bosnians, people becoming Muslim en masse, because the culture, the canopy is Islam. So now when you come to the United States of America or England, the canopy is not Islam.
Scary.
So yes, you can have your institutions and so forth, but in the long term, can one confidently say that if the canopy is not Islam, that generations over a period of time will survive this? And for me, that's difficult. Now, the argument that's made to me is, but the Muslim countries are like this, and this. I say, I get it, but my struggle is for Allah Ta'ala. My struggle is different here. So a lot of Muslims come to Muslim countries, and I've heard this from Muslims before. They'll come from the West, learn what they want, and go back. And then Muslim countries feel like you're coming, you're taking, you're going. My idea was, I've come here to give you something. And you may not want what I'm giving you, but I still want to be here. You're my brothers in Islam. Let's do this. And in the end of the day, if I joke with my students all the time, I say, when I die, I want to be buried here and say he died trying. Because in the end of the day, that's all you can do, right? And that's 10 years ago, if you'd have asked me, I'd have said, I think we should move. Now that I've got a bit older, I say never say never, and I accept the fact that not everybody can leave. I understand it's difficult, and that's a price that we were going to have to pay, and we need to think about that.
Right. So we're about to kind of slow down. So we got just 2 more final questions, and then we'll kind of wrap this one up. So real quickly. So somebody asked, maybe you can summarize these, but one was during the last stages of the Ottoman Empire, did it become decadent, and were they relatively maintain? Did they relatively maintain their abstinence from dunya/materialism? Basically, could its collapse be also attributed to spiritual corruption? That's one, and the final one on this one was there's one up here. Actually, start with that one, and I'll come back to the next one.
It's difficult to know. I don't know what's in people's hearts to really critique that sort of like spiritual corruption. One of the things that you see in we call it the critique culture of the ulema, is that they've always critiqued people of their generation, that the people of the past were better.
Yeah.
And if you read that critique culture, you're always going to think that that generation's decadent. So it's a little bit unfair.
And the final one is, can you ask Dr. Yakoob, does he think it is possible to revive some type of new world power, Turkey, Ottoman Empire, / Turkish Ottoman Empire?
Maybe not the Ottoman Empire, but the world is our oyster. You can do whatever you want.
It's funny because I remember a Twitter conversation. I'm not going to mention this historian, but he was like kind of bemoaning the idea of people wanting a caliphate again, and he was saying, "Oh well, which version of the caliphate you want? Do you want the Ottomans, or do you want the Sokoto Khilafah, or do you want the Ayyubids?" I'm like, thinking in my mind, the caliphate is for that time. You don't.
I'll take any one of them.
I'll take it. I'll take the Khilafah for now, the one that's made for this time. And it was just like, I don't understand some people's like hate or and these are like a small sliver of Muslims who are practicing Muslims who because maybe they had like bad interactions with Islamic movements and stuff, they have like this internal like visceral reaction, disdain almost like, how
I heard a brother say that he said that some of his teachers said that it is very unwise and it's something that goes against the principle of Islam to talk about establishing a khilafah. Yeah. And as a brother that I respected very much, but look, a lot of times we learn so many different things. There's so many different states of confusion that occur. People are all trying to find something to bring their love back of Islamic. That's what we're talking about. Arturo, it wasn't historically accurate you can ask a historian, but what it did was it gave people, number one, it gave us a gauge of where people's spirits are, of how much they're looking for a change, and they're looking for something to look up to, which is guised or in the cloak of Islam, which is very necessary for all of us, right? But the other thing is that they know that when they see something like that, it's going to put certain ideas of change within themselves too, right? Yeah. And they can embody that change and do something with it. So I think this state of confusion is what it is, but regardless, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants a change to happen, He creates those means of changes, and the believers can see it from a distance. Some can see it, some can't. But, like you said, never say never, man. Allah can let happen. Like, think about the whole Daesh thing that you said. This is the last thing I'll say. The Daesh thing, nobody thought that it would have all these Muslims that never even wanted to talk about Caliphate came out and said, no, this has nothing to do with the Caliphate. Right? So I think there's no way of knowing anything.
I think we should end this show on the Arabic proverb, al-hal la tadum. Like, meaning that nothing lasts forever. But like, for example, if you look at like just Palestine, right? 100 years, that's nothing for Palestine. It changed hands, Salahuddin Ayyubi to the Crusaders, and then, back from the Crusaders back to Salahuddin Ayyubi, right? 100 years is nothing. These empires that we're dealing with today are a couple hundred years old, 200, maybe some in Europe have kingdoms, but as modern states, they're less, a couple hundred years old. Right. We're talking about states in Islam that were 700 years old, right? Yeah. Roughly around that period. It's just a matter of when Allah wills and when people are ready for it, and when they want to work for it. Never lose hope.
Yeah.
Jazakallah khair.
This was a real treat, man. This was a real treat.
It was an amazing show. One of my favorites of the year. Barakallah fi. We thank you. People who don't know, Ustad has been lecturing all day, yesterday and today. He came out here, so we're incredibly grateful. Please like and subscribe. Help us out on patreon.com/the Mad Mamluks. We'll see you all next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Hopefully we didn't bore you.
Questions are still coming in.
It's all good, bro.
Okay, if you can come on now.
Sorry if we have you in hijab.